Hello, everybody, and welcome back to our second annual virtual summit. We're here today with Patrick Springer. And Patrick Springer is a former reporter from the Fargo Forum. We've worked with him a lot over the last few years on the wild horses at Theodore Roosevelt National Park, and he has done a great job covering the story. Um, he does have a new book coming out about the Theodore Roosevelt National Park wild horses, and it's called Untamed, the story of the horses of Theodore Roosevelt National Park, and he'll talk about that today too. He's going to talk about a little bit about working with the press. He's got a couple points to talk. Everyone, so that you know, your video and your mics are muted. If you have questions, we ask that you put them in the chat, and then we'll try to get to your questions after his presentation. So I'm going to turn it over to Patrick, and thank you for being here.
Well, hi everybody. Happy to be here. I think it might be pertinent to just start out by explaining how it came to be that I started writing about these horses, and it was 20 years ago that I first wrote about the Nakota horses, which you might know are a breed of horses that originated in Theodore Roosevelt National Park. And the story was actually pretty old at that point. These brothers, the Kuntz brothers, Leo and Frank Kuntz of Linton, North Dakota, had been sort of rescuing these horses for, more than 20 years at that point. And I had seen a few articles in the Bismarck Tribune or the Associated Press, but they were very scanty because the story was kind of old and they were just little incremental stories. And I just thought, wow, that's interesting. The origins of the horse partly involves, horses surrendered by Sitting Bull and his followers and ranchers. So there was just a really interesting backstory. So I wrote, I met these two brothers, Frank and Leo Kuntz, and Castle McLaughlin, who was kind of an unlikely partner, an anthropologist at Harvard who had studied the horses and wrote really the definitive history of the park horses back in 1989. So anyway, that was the beginning. And these two brothers, now sadly Leo is no longer living, but Leo and Frank, they kept calling me all the time, frankly, over the years. And I just kept writing about the Nakotas for a while, and then that drew me into writing about the park horses. But this was always just a sideline for me. My real responsibilities at the forum involve things like healthcare and politics and the environment and things going on right around Fargo-Moorhead. This park is at the other end of the state, far away. It's like 5 or 6 hours away by car. So it's not something that we routinely wrote about, frankly, ever. But then they were in danger. As you know, the park wanted to get rid of them, and that was a process. So I wrote a great deal about them during that period. Um, well, I think maybe just to start us off, I would like you to try, when you're dealing with the press, try to think like a journalist. I'm assuming that from your point of view, you want publicity, you want public awareness. And as journalists, we're aware of that, and that's fine. We're happy to be sort of your conduit, but we are naturally interested in a good story. And for us, a good story is something that will be read or viewed. It's something that will grab the reader's or the viewer's interest. And so, you know, if you've got a good story to tell, that really you've got the wind at your back if you do. So again, try to think in terms of, okay, how might this interest, a broad audience? Why is this important? And you want to make sure that you're conveying those points when you're dealing with a reporter. Now, maybe this is old hat to you. I don't know, but I would encourage you also to kind of be familiar with the landscape, the media landscape. So what I mean by that is have some kind of awareness of news outlets and who are the logical, newspapers or broadcast stations that you want to pitch to. And beyond that, you would be smart, I think, to even look to see if you can figure out are there certain reporters that you think might be a good fit because this is what they cover or they just seem to be interested, or you just notice you like their work, you think they do a good job, and they would therefore be a good reporter to help you tell your story, to get your points out. Um, Now, I don't know how often this is going to be possible for you, but there's a difference between mere information and a story. And a story is a narrative. It kind of appeals to pathos or emotion or compassion. And frankly, if you can tell a story rather than merely conveying information, you are going to get more attention, more readership or viewership. And it's also going to register with people at a deeper level. And I think people remember stories, but we quickly forget information. It's really kind of fleeting. Granted, a lot of information is really just that, information. But if you can find a story to tell and a story to pitch, that is, you're really probably going to land with a much greater effect. Um, Getting to the horses of Theodore Roosevelt National Park, for example, as you probably know, for more than 2 years, for the better part of 3 years, they were at risk. The park embarked on this planning process, and then they called for a livestock management plan, and it quickly became evident that the real agenda was to get rid of the horses. And the only question was, would they do it quickly or gradually? And so they were in peril. And so that's an inherently dramatic situation, and it was ongoing. It was episodic. And there was a process. The National Park Service went through this process of public meetings and steps, and so there were just lots of built-in increments to keep following the story. And I must say that you're all familiar with Chris, of course. I would urge you to consider her as a model because she has been very, very active, as you know, in trying to get her story out. And so she has, of course, a blog and her website. And on her website, she has a lot of resources, the Castle McLaughlin report, all kinds of important documents. And also, as I mentioned, she has this blog, and I don't think a week goes by that Chris isn't putting out a blog post and multiple posts many weeks. So she has constant contact with her audience. And as a reporter, I'm on a subscription list, so I would always get these. I would always read them. They generated many stories. We were in pretty regular contact, especially during this 2, 3 year period when the horses were at risk. And she was calling me or emailing me. I was calling her or emailing me. She made herself very valuable as a resource person. And she was doing a lot of her own research, digging up information and passing it along. Now, by the way, that raises a point. When you're dealing with reporters, there can be a distinction between just putting out a news release. This is something you want everybody to know, and everybody gets a crack at it at the same time. And then on the other hand, um, working with a reporter and maybe saying, "Hey, here's something you might be interested in. Here are some documents, or here's some information." And then the reporter will work to develop that on his or her own. And there are advantages in doing that. Yes, you're only dealing with one reporter instead of many at the same time. But when a reporter has an exclusive story or a scoop, he or she is probably going to be a lot more invested in it because there's just kind of more prestige, and you get to break the story. And so they're going to be willing to put in more time and effort and to go beyond just merely rewriting a press release. So if you've got something that's really important, you might consider, is there a certain reporter, a certain news outlet, a newspaper, or a broadcast station that, would really be interested in this and would work at it? And you would actually, I would argue, you would get greater impact from that. I might explain for those of you who aren't familiar, the Forum, the newspaper I worked for, well, the better part of 40 years, is the largest paper in news in North Dakota. And it's also owned by really the largest media company in the state. They own newspapers around the state and some broadcast stations. So all of these websites are kind of linked. So a story that appears in the Forum also appears over this network. So we had I think, a rather unusual reach, which made us, frankly, kind of a strategic target. If you're Chris Command, it would make sense. You would probably want to be dealing with somebody at the forum because of the reach that paper has. So just something to think about. There are times when you definitely just want to, get the word out to everybody at the same time. But I think that there might be other times when you want, when it's a more involved, complicated story that requires some depth, you might probably have better luck just at least dealing at the outset with a particular reporter at a particular newspaper. Now, I do think it's pretty common that other news organizations will follow along. They'll see the story and they'll say, "Hey, that's of interest to our readers, our viewers." So I will pick up on that and do my own version of it. So you can still, there's a good chance you'll still get a pretty wide reach when you do that. Um, I think that you will want to, as I kind of alluded to already, you want to develop a rapport with reporters. Um, by that I mean you want to get to know them a little bit. If you can, maybe you can just walk into the newsroom and drop off a news release, or you know, you somehow want to ideally get to know somebody. If there's going to be somebody who's going to be, covering this as an ongoing issue, you definitely want to get to know that person a little bit so that you have kind of rapport. There's a connection, and so if you can do that, I think that's all to the better, so that when your news release lands in the email inbox, they're more likely to click on it rather than just delete it right away. I have to tell you what you're up against. As a newspaper reporter, we just get so many emails unsolicited. I'm just buried every day in emails, and I don't even open most of them because I can't. And I look at the subject line or the sender, and I make a very quick judgment about whether that's even worth clicking on. And very often I just delete it right away, or I just go and unsubscribe because we just get buried with these things. So keep that in mind, and don't let that discourage you. I mean, you have to be persistent. Chris is very, very persistent. You may or may not know that she studied environmental journalism in college, and so I think she came to this with an awareness that most don't have. And so she is, as I already said, she's been very good about just pounding the drum. And if you want to have impact, you have to just keep beating the drum. And in a case where, a very popular wild horse herd, very well known, is threatened, its very existence is threatened, that you've kind of got the wind at your back there, because a lot of people care about that. A lot of people will follow it. We found that people care about these horses, and so the stories that we were writing got a pretty good reception. Um, I can tell you that at Forum Communications, they analyze and measure everything. We know how many people click on every story. We know how long they spend on a story. We know if they recirculate, which means they stay on our website or just bounce right off. And so naturally, this guides our thinking. For a long, long time, I would just kind of automatically write about things that I thought were important. And I'm not sure that a lot of our readers agreed. Now we have a way of measuring that, and in a way that makes it more difficult. You want to be in that category of things that people care about and will click on and read. And if you're not in that category, it's a tougher battle. You might just get a short mention. You might not get any mention. I mean, it's just the news business has just become brutal in the last 10 or 15 years, especially. We are literally fighting for survival, and we find that we just have to focus our energies and our time on things that people really care about and will click on and maybe subscribe to us. And if it's outside that category, you know, we might just ignore it, and in a way that we didn't used to. And I think that's very sad, but it's just the world that we live in. Um, Maybe just another, I'm sorry, when I was making this point about the difference between a story and just mere information, I can actually give you a few examples that came into play with the Theodore Roosevelt Park herd. And the first one was actually years ago, back in 2018. Some of you might know this horse. He was called a stallion named Gray Ghost, and he had this beautiful flowing mane and a light gray coat that gave him his name. And he had lived for 16 years, but he had been getting he was in obvious decline, and then he died. And a woman who photographs these horses very regularly, Tiffany Crago, went out to sort of pay him a last visit. She hiked into the wilderness, and she was there. And suddenly she found a bunch of buffalo had lined up on the hillside. And so she moved away, and one by one, they all came up to Gray Ghost and sniffed him, and they seemed to be mourning him. And she posted that on her Facebook page. And I saw that and I thought, oh my gosh, that's a great story. I mean, it obviously tugs at the heartstrings. And so I wrote about that, and the story did very well. Now, during the couple of years or so that the horses were in jeopardy, a couple of standout cases came up. One was a horse named Alluvium, who was a young stallion, a bachelor stallion, and there were some trail riders in the park, and Illuvium came up to them, and he showed interest in a young mare who was with their group. And a ranger who was visiting them at this horse camp in the park asked them if they were having any problems. And they merely mentioned this. I guess a woman had been bucked off, and they mentioned to the strangers. Well, this became construed as a complaint, and poor Alluvium was labeled as a nuisance horse. So by the time we learned about this, Alluvium was in a holding pen, branded a nuisance animal, and he was destined to be removed from the park. By this point, I believe the horses, if I remember correctly, the park had backed off because of intense public pressure. They were no longer going to get rid of the horses, but frankly, the superintendent just seemed to want to get rid of this horse as a way of, just sort of, I don't know, poking people in the eye or something. So we wrote about that, and it made something that's kind of abstract. Yes, these are, there's this sort of nameless, faceless herd, but suddenly it boils down to this horse, Alluvium. And then later, the park really surprised everybody after again deciding that the horses would stay. They staged a roundup, and they were going to remove some horses, and then they were forced to back off from removing mares. But then they said it was all about gathering genetic information, and that was probably not necessary because they really had all the genetic information they could conceivably need from earlier testing, not long before that. Well, and so a poor mare, a filly, was injured. Her name was Aspen, and she was let loose, and she died. And Chris found out about this, put it on her Facebook page and her blog, and I wrote about that. And there again, it just got a lot of attention. This poor horse, and it just personified it was a story, not just mere information. So I hope, and I don't know, I do think I have to concede that the Theodore Roosevelt National Park herd is probably it's different than most and possibly unique because it's within a national park, and there's a loop road that goes around the park, so they're pretty accessible. And each of these horses has been named. Their bands are known. The people who are really devoted to these horses know all of their names. They know their bands. They kind of know their life stories. I'm sure that's not true of many or most wild horse herds. And so there again, I think that was fortunate for these horses. They had that going for them. Um, well, I hope that's helpful. I think I just want to open it up to questions now.
Thanks, Patrick. I have a bunch of questions. I was writing a bunch of things as you were talking because there's a lot of things that you said that made me remember. And one of the things that I get asked all the time is how did we do what we did? And last year I said I did a whole presentation on making it an issue and all the different ways between state legislators, the press, all the different things that we did. And like you said, one thing is you and I had a relationship even before 2022. I will say that I think that there were some times from 2022 to 2024, I feel like I talked to you more than I talked to my mother, and she lives with me. Um, but we did talk a lot. Um, I wanted to ask you to help other people understand. You said that I was a valuable resource for you for your stories. What made me a valuable resource, or what do you feel made me a trusted resource, I guess?
Well, for one thing, you did your homework. You did a lot of homework. You were out there actively searching, asking your own questions continually, and compiling information. So I think even before this whole episode started, you had a well-developed website, and I think you had your blog already at that point. As I mentioned, you had, I think you call it resources, so you could click on that, and it's kind of like an archival library where there are important documents about everything from Gonacon, the birth control drug, to Castle McLaughlin's report. I had a copy of Castle McLaughlin's report, a paper report that she had given me many years ago. But up until Chris had to actually, as I recall, file a Freedom of Information Act request to pry it loose from the park's hands so she could get a copy so that she could then post. So today, that, if anybody knows about her website, it's easy to find. Whereas before, there were only a few copies, in existence, and they basically were in the offices of the National Park Service. Um, I will say that I think the Park Service did not do itself any favors by just having a wall of silence. They never answered almost any of my questions, and if they did answer them, they just gave a bland, general, canned response. They didn't get into any specifics, but they mostly, frankly, just ignored me, and they mostly just ignored other people. And
But
this
that
did
was
not
new,
do
I
me
think
any
that you had
favors.
said too, right? That was something new that happened prior, like,
Well, good point. Yes, before this happened, and maybe before that superintendent, who probably was just brought in to get rid of the horses, that's certainly the suspicion, and that seemed to be, supported by the timing. Before then, you could call up the park, talk to the superintendent, talk to their chief of interpretation, talk to their resource chief, kind of the top wildlife biologist, and they were very accessible. And I'm a pack rat, so I save everything, which is very fortunate because that was very valuable when I came to write the book. So probably about every piece of paper that I ever received about these horses, the Nakota horses and the park horses, I still had in my files. And when I was putting together the book recently, I went through the uh, all of these old papers, and I was just struck by how they used to be just so helpful and so forthcoming. And I think they became at some point unnecessarily, maybe adversarial is too strong of a word, but just resistant and aloof and unresponsive. And I think that really hurt them, and not just with the press, but I know that people in and around Medora, even state legislators, state officials, they got really pretty much the same brush off, which is really extraordinary. Frankly, about the only person that they really listened to seemed to be John Hoeven, a U.S. senator who is on the Appropriations Committee, and he's the guy who really, it was Chris, as an activist and me as a journalist, but it came down to Senator Hoeven, who had the
and the
power.
historical society. The historical society was pretty big too.
Yes, good point. Yeah, and the Historical Society got involved and said these are historically significant, and the park, because of a federal law, had to pay attention to that. They couldn't just ignore them. So, but it was a lot of things that came together. But just to circle back, Chris made herself very valuable. She gained expertise. She worked with a law firm and a lobbying firm. She did her own research. She got plugged into the network of wild horse activists, learned from them, got support from them, and frankly worked really, really hard for a really long time, I think.
And
You know,
still, yes.
yes.
Let me ask you this too, because I know that there were a few times too. How important is it, or how helpful is it, as like to have different contacts? I know I put you in contact with a few different experts and things like that. How helpful is that for a reporter?
Oh, yes. Very helpful. You had come across a wildlife biologist, Eric Mulvar, who is not really a wild horse specialist, but is a wildlife biologist, and knows about population dynamics and breeding and what is required to keep a population genetically viable. And I talked to him, and there are others I can think of. Maybe I don't know, it was from you, Chris, that I started talking to Ross McPhee, another biologist. He was with the National museum, Natural History Museum in New York, and he was very helpful. Um, and another example, I talked about Alluvium, the poor horse who was removed from the park, turned into a gelding. Um, uh, I presume, Chris, that we started riding some horses just based on what the park announcing that he was on his way out, and you protesting and trying to gain support for keeping him there. And then through that, I guess the people who were in this trail riding party
Right.
got in touch with you, and then you put me in touch with them. So I talked to two of the six members, and their story was very, very different from the park version of events. They were saying that, we never complained, he was doing what was natural. He was a young stallion. He wasn't really even aggressive. He just showed interest. And, the woman who was bucked, I talked to her, and her horse was just kind of skittish. And, along that same trail ride, when the horse was nowhere in sight, the horse again bucked, and she thought it might have been a brush or something. So, and she just said, "Look, those are horses, and when you go into a park, you know that there are going to be wildlife. It's just a risk that you take." So, anyway, that was, I think, a really great story, and it really kind of, well, I will use the phrase, put the lie to what the park said, because, and I talked to another woman who corroborated, what she said. So I had, um, so right, I think, it's smart to not just be yourself a source of information, but to put a reporter in touch with others. And reporters, of course, do that naturally as they go about. But as I explained, I wrote an awful lot about these horses over, the last 2 or 3 years, an awful lot. And frankly, that was deliberately because I've done this a long time, and I know that sustained attention, you only get change through sustained attention. I use the phrase
Exactly.
you have to keep beating the drum. And so there was a drumbeat of stories. Chris was, beating her drum with a drumbeat of news releases, blog posts, email blasts, what have you. And uh, that is what it really takes, and that all takes effort. But but sure, report. Oh, I just want to make the point that yes, I wrote a ton of stories about these horses, and yet it was just a small fraction of the stories that I was writing for the paper during this period. I'm mostly doing other things. So I will say, I'm really not a horse person. I love horses, but I can barely ride a horse. And going into this, didn't really know much about horses. I was frankly a history buff, and the historical background of these horses interested me a great deal, and that was part of what drew me in. But I would say that Chris was lucky that there was a reporter who was as interested as I was, and just kept with the story to kind of an unusual degree. I mean, other reporters certainly were writing about this. There was a Bismarck television station that was probably the next most involved, and there was also a Fargo television station, our affiliated. The same company owns the Fargo television station that owns the Forum, but frankly, a lot of times I was just out there alone writing about these horses, and that was fine. And I think they did get attention.
They
Um,
did, because I can say, because something else that you had said, um, all the different stories that you wrote, that led to the Wall Street Journal finding us and us having an article in the Wall Street Journal. And I'm sure it played a part in the Washington Post, because we had an op-ed that they came to us and said, "Hey, we'd like you to write your perspective on this." So I think that also helped too. So sometimes it may seem like you said, like it's a local newspaper. For again, for people who don't know here, like this isn't like the New York Times or the Chicago Tribune, but in North Dakota it is, right? It is for us. So Patrick is on the other side of the state. They do have another company here in the town right outside of Medora, the Dickinson Press. So a lot of times what you had written would be in that paper. But I don't think they don't print as often as the Forum does, I don't think, here in Dickinson. But so that relationship was important. Another thing too, that you touched on that I wanted to say is, um, I learned this as we went through every we have an AP reporter in our state, and I'm sure some states have more. But the job of the AP reporters are to bring your state's news to a national level. And so when you had said, like, you couldn't always write a story, I can tell you that Jack Dura, our AP reporter, he's in regular contact with me. Sometimes he does, sometimes he writes a story, sometimes he doesn't, but he just wants to stay up to date so that, like he knows with the federal legislation, there's a story brewing, but there's nothing to really say at a national level right now. So, but he likes to keep in touch and things like that on different things. So that's another point that you had talked about. Um, and there were times because we had talked so much and because you had covered this so much, um, that I did give you exclusive stories, that I talked to you before I talked to other reporters and let you get your story out. So those are things that I think are all common that you had talked about. But a couple questions I have for you is how effective do you think letters to the editor are to creating a journalism relationship? I know for like our state legislators, they said that they were looking at that, but how much do you look at that as like a hot topic? Because when this first started, I don't think that there was a day that a newspaper in North Dakota, you could open it up and not see a letter to the editor about the anger over the park trying to get rid of the horses. So how important do you think that is?
I think that probably did play a role, maybe more so with editors than with me as a reporter. But I was very lucky. My editors supported this story. I maybe should confess that I probably had more time and latitude than most reporters are going to have, simply because Chris mentioned I just retired at the end of December after about 40 years at the Forum, 44 years as a reporter. So I was very senior, um, which is just a nice way of saying old, and but seasoned. So given I think an unusual degree of again latitude, and probably got to have a greater voice in what I did with my time. There's always a mix with reporters. You come up with self-assigned stories, but you are also assigned stories by your editors, and a lot of things, the news business being what it is, it's the news of the day. Some stories you want to get to, and maybe you will be able to, but maybe not, for a little while. But yeah, getting back to letters to the editor, anything that just, keeps public awareness, maintains public awareness, shows interest. I think that sends a message to editors, because as I explained before, and more so today than before, we want to be relevant. We have to be relevant to survive. We're kind of like the wild horses, It's like every day is a fight for survival in the news business. So yeah, that's sure. Now the thing is, we can tell if it's just a canned letter writing, and I'm sure politicians
Right.
can. If it's a form letter, maybe the first one that comes in the transom will run that, but after that, probably won't. So
Right.
you want to say something unique, you want to say something worthwhile, you don't want to be too long. For the forum, we ask that letters be no more than 250 words. There's something kind of a guest column, we call it an op-ed, that can be up to about 450 words, but obviously that should be well written, and we would have to be quite interested in order to consider running that. The forum's own editorials are only about 400, 450 words too. So we limit ourselves, and a news article can be longer, especially now in the web era. But when you're just dealing with the print, you can only, there's only so much space. And again, that happily isn't really the case anymore with the online versions. But yeah, whatever you can do, letters to the editor are another way, to keep the, public attention focused on your cause.
Let me ask you this. Like I said, I had talked to you before 2022 when the announcement came to eliminate the horses, but there were still a lot of newspapers, news outlets in North Dakota that I didn't have contacts with. Or another thing too is over the years, reporters come and go, especially at TV stations. And I've talked to like, and it gets frustrating because you have to start all over again then. So it was always nice to talk to you because we had a history and we can just pick up like, hey, remember when I told you this, and not have to tell you the whole story. But I remember early on when the park announced their plans to eliminate the horses, me and my husband were watching the news every night and like waiting for somebody to say something, and nobody was saying anything. So after I think a day or two, I just emailed every editor or newsroom in the state and said, hey, did you know the park just said they're getting rid of the horses? Is going through an editor like that um something like how do if you don't have a contact at a newspaper, how do you establish that contact?
Oh, yes. Good question. Sure. In fact,
Because
I
the editor wouldn't the editor like, so if I said, hey, here's an issue with the horses, they would be like, well, hey, Patrick usually handles this and give you the story. Is that how that would work? Or
Yes. They would either have somebody in mind for it because it's sort of, if not exactly what they cover, they might know that the person's interested or it's kind of adjacent to what they cover. If you have somebody covering environmental news, for example. Um, so yes, by all means, you can send it to an editor and you want to call, for the reason, Chris, that you just mentioned, editors might stick around a little longer than reporters. So yes, that's a good suggestion too. You want to think about editors or and broadcast producers as well as or news directors as well as editors. Um, but ultimately, you're really going to be dealing with a reporter. It's going to be the reporter who goes out and does the story. Um, and you might just send something to both, especially if you're not really getting a good response. But again, there are times, as you already alluded to, where the AP reporter, keeps tabs and but doesn't always write a story. I mentioned that the Kuntz brothers used to call me all the time, and it was always pretty much the same call. The horse, the horse, the park should stop getting rid of these horses. They should be, taking back the Nakotas. And I had written about that, and you can't, it has to be new, it has to be fresh,
right.
or it's not really news anymore. So that's your challenge is to come up with fresh angles, new angles, wrinkles. Otherwise, you're just not going to get their interest probably.
So let me ask you this, because that leads into this, and then I'll go into the chat box because there's some questions too. But with today, with the like, we have so much news coming at us from every direction. How do we keep wild horses and burros in the news when we're competing with, we just bombed Venezuela and maybe are at war today? Like, how do you, like like we talked about during my presentation, there are times that I question myself, like, with what's happening in the world, and here I am, like, the horses at Theodore Roosevelt National Park, and beating the drum, as you said. How do we keep this in the news when we're competing with so much in the news these days?
That is a very good question. And I wish I had a better answer. And it kind of boils down to the things that I've already mentioned. If you can try to tell a story, if there's a story somehow in this, it could be a horse, it could be a band of horses, it could be a horse advocate. Just if it's a story, I think you're going to get somebody very interested in it. And if it's of obvious importance and impact, that will help you. Um, and unfortunately, horses are such good survivors. They're so intelligent, they're so resourceful, they're so tough that they multiply. And so this is a problem if you're managing public lands. They are forced to control those populations. And of course, how they do that matters a great deal. And left to their own devices, they're likely to be callous and maybe even cruel about it. We know this, and so if you do your own, if cruelty is involved, for example, and if you've got some video, showing this somehow, wow, then obviously television particularly would be interested in that. It sometimes boils down to your own creativity and your own resourcefulness and willingness to put in the time and the effort to come up with information that will be of interest and will get some journalist interested in what it is that the message you're trying to get out.
Okay. Craig said, how does what's happening to the TRMP Mustangs of use in getting fairer treatment of all the legal Mustangs and burros in their legal herd areas on BLM and Forest Service land that should be fairly defended as viable and naturally adapted, healthy living herds? I think that this is what he means, but I think we have a unique situation in North Dakota, where these horses aren't competing with land with cattle ranchers. Um, Theodore Roosevelt National Park is a huge tour, I think the biggest tourist attraction in the state, if I'm correct. And the horses we know play a huge part in that. Um, so I think I mean, I don't say this enough. When the battle started to get rid of these horses, the North Dakota Stockmen's Association came out in support of keeping the horses. That's huge in a wild horse world because that doesn't happen anywhere else. You know what I mean? Like, I don't think that there's any other stockmen's associations in Wyoming saying, let the horses run free. I think that there's issues with that. So I think, does that sound right to you, Patrick? I don't know if you have anything else to add.
Yeah, that's a good point. And I actually know very little about the BLM herds because we're far from any of those herds. The closest, I believe, would be the Pryor Mountain herd in Montana, Wyoming. And so this is maybe atypical in a way, but you know what? There's an analog here. Right, cattle are not an issue in a national park, but other wildlife species
Right.
are. And the horses for forever have suffered by being, in essence, second-class citizens. The National Park Service does not regard them as a native species compared to the bison, the elk, pronghorn, any of the other grazing species. So they have primacy. They're more important. And in fact, that's why they wanted to get rid of them because they're competitors. They all eat grass. And I think the Park Service was especially looking ahead to climate change and the increased stress that, more frequent and more severe drought would have on their grass. And so they wanted to just get rid of the horses. And it's really the same story, just a permutation of the same story.
Right. That's true. A good point. Um, Thea wants to know, can you address how you find out the names of local news outlet reporters that are specifically assigned to publishing about wild equine related issues? I think we kind of touched on that. Um,
I don't know what it's like out west, and if you're a paper that's located near, these BLM herds, they probably in those newsrooms do have somebody. I mean, you might just call the newsroom number and ask for the person and find out if you could get the phone number and an email address. You could do it that way. Or as I suggested earlier, you can pay attention to that broadcast station or that paper and see if anybody writes about it. You can look through their archives, maybe do some Google searching, see if there's anybody who's still around who does it. But failing that, just call them up, get a name, contact information.
I wanted to say one other thing because you did talk about the forum has the newspaper and then they have also the news station. So and I've been Michael McGurran at WDAY has been great and he's been also another consistent reporter that I've talked to over the years. But you guys also have a podcast too, and I know I've talked to your podcast groups and stuff too a few times. Jay Thomas, I've been on his show, and I think that even though like if you're looking at somebody specifically for equine related issues, sometimes talking to somebody else might not be bad. Like Jay Thomas is not a horse loving show, right? It's a political show. So that gave us a whole different audience of people to talk to. So I think just taking advantage of all those different outlets, I think does that also make sense?
Oh, absolutely. And that's a good point. You're kind of preaching to the choir, maybe if you're just staying within your own little
Correct.
sphere. If you can get outside of that, you obviously have a broader reach.
Okay. How effective is it for public citizens not living in an affected herds area to giving testimony, either live or written on legislation? I can tell you if it's legislation like state legislation or federal, um, for us and even BLM lands, these are our public lands. So I think that anybody has a right to give a voice to that and to provide testimony. So I would always do that. And I do know that they look at the uh, number of testimonies that they receive and they look at how unique they are, just like you were saying about your letters to the editor and stuff. So I would think that as far as legislation goes, it's always good to use your voice. Um, how do you find out who the AP reporter is in a state? I think that you can just look up your local AP office. Um, I was lucky, and this is why I wanted to ask the first question I asked you, Patrick, is like what made me valuable? Because the more that Patrick and I talked, the more that other reporters figured out how to contact me. And so I think the AP reporter just contacted me. I didn't have to seek him out, so I was lucky. But I think the more that you talk to people, correct, the more um, I know that when people come see us in Medora, like they're just like, she's the horse lady. Like that's how I'm known. I don't even know, some people don't even know my name. But and like you had said, there's a new editor at our local paper here that's part of the forum, the Dickinson Press. And I did meet Sarah in person at an event, and she knew exactly who I was, and I have never seen her before. So I think that like I said, I would start by contacting the local AP office. Do you think, Patrick? I don't know. You would have a better idea about that. Jack Dura found me, so I don't know how. I wouldn't have known how to find him.
Yeah, right. This used to be very, very easy. We used to have bureaus in North Dakota. We used to have an AP bureau in Fargo and one in Bismarck. And there's really not a bureau anymore. It's just one guy whose name is Jack Dura, who probably works out of his home. So, but you could still Google Associated Press North Dakota and probably find somebody. I will say, in North Dakota, it is true that the Associated Press really is looking for stories that would have a national audience. And maybe it's important to know why that is. It's because they essentially have no members in North Dakota anymore. The Bismarck Tribune, and then some small, maybe a couple of small, very small papers and radio stations. But frankly, the Associated Press does not have much reach in North Dakota anymore. So frankly, they're forced to go outside of North Dakota just to find an audience. And that is why Jack Dura has to think in terms of national audience. But I can tell you that 10 years ago, that was not the case. They had all, we used to be strong members of the Associated Press, which meant that our stories could be picked up by the Associated Press and available to other Associated Press members. And we, of course, could grab anything off the Associated Press wires that we subscribed to. And I don't know, this is maybe inside baseball, but it's, at least in North Dakota, the AP doesn't have much presence.
And that's one other point I wanted. Maybe you'll have something to say about this too. Another thing that we did as far as the press went over the last few years was we had gotten we were part of the North Dakota News Association. And so, like, if we sent information or press releases to them, it would go out to all, even the smaller papers in North Dakota. Is that something that, I mean, and I think that that's changed a little bit over the years. And we have our new Michael Standard is, I think, part of that North Dakota News Co-op.
Yeah, you're referring to the North Dakota Newspaper Association, which is the trade group essentially of
Right.
newspaper. We belong to that. Pretty much every daily and weekly newspaper, the broadcasters have their version of that. And at least in the newspaper, the North Dakota Newspaper Association, and I'm guessing there's an equivalent of this to most states. They do indeed have a service where if you send them a news release, they will distribute it. And I don't know if there's a fee for that. I'm not, I've never dealt with that.
We had a fee
So
for being a part of the
yeah,
association, like an
yeah.
association fee. But how much do you look at that, or the releases that come?
That's a better question for an editor because they probably go to editors, not to reporters.
Okay.
But anything that enhances your visibility and your reach is probably worth it.
Okay. And plus, I think that you never know too. Like if you send a release out, like you never know when you're looking for space for a story. I don't know if that happens so much today, but Theo wants to know, does the NPS consider wild equines as feral as opposed to wildlife? They were calling them livestock. Like that's where they downgraded them to. So that was part of the argument over the last few years. And Craig wants to know, is TRMP ignoring all the many positive contributions that naturally living horses make to ecosystems as a return North American keystone species? Yeah, the park, I think that when people ask me, maybe Patrick, I don't know if you agree with this, when people ask me why the park wanted to get rid of the horses, I always say that I think it's as simple and as complicated as the park is charged with maintaining this natural prairie ecosystem. And to them, the horses are not native, therefore they should not be part of that ecosystem. I think it's something
Yeah.
that simple and that complicated.
Right. That is huge. Now, the National Park Service has kind of a dual mandate. Some of their parks, Yellowstone, Glacier, for example, are clearly all about ecosystem preservation and preserving the natural world so people can experience it and enjoy it, and that we preserve it. And then, though, they also, they run Mount Rushmore, the Lincoln Memorial. So they have a big mandate to also preserve cultural history. And, not to get too far in the weeds, but just very briefly, Theodore Roosevelt National Park was originally called Theodore Roosevelt National Memorial Park, and it was all about preserving the time of Theodore Roosevelt when he was a rancher and a hunter in the Badlands. And then that all changed in 1978 when it became Theodore Roosevelt National Park. And I think the public wasn't even aware of it. The mission changed and it became all about ecosystems. Um, but yes, to answer the question, I think that the National Park Service does not want to acknowledge that, gosh, there can be, benefits of horses grazing. And then I actually wrote about, how dubious it is to say that they're not a native species. And I won't go into that at length, but I mean, just very briefly, it's indisputed that the ancestors of the horses originated in North America about 55 million years ago, and that they were, the fossil record shows, the bone record shows that they were here till it used to be thought that they went extinct at the time of the Ice Age around 10,000 years ago, but they keep finding new discoveries, and now they're down to like 4,000, 4,500 years ago. So there's about a 4,500-year gap. Now, the bison is considered a native species, and it's also our national mammal. And yet, Ross McPhee will point out that bison came over the Bering Land Bridge about 180,000 years ago. And yet we regard that as a native species. And yet the horse ancestors have a much, much longer, deeper history here. It's crazy.
I have one more question and then we'll talk about your book because you did talk about the dynamics of your websites now and how you can tell how much people are reading. How valuable is it, or how important is it like when we say, please share this post, and we want people to share like your newspaper articles and things like that? How important are things like that to get more clicks onto that to that
Yeah,
story?
good point. Now our website, and I'm sure this is true of many, we have a paywall where you have to be a subscriber to get access to certain articles, but others are not behind the paywall and anybody can see them. And so if we think it's kind of an exclusive story, we're likely to put that behind a paywall. So that will obviously limit the number of people who will see it. But um, these things can kind of become viral to an extent. So if they're widely shared and then widely clicked on and then shared again, those numbers will kind of blow up, or they can blow up. And like on our website anyway, it's kind of dynamic. And in a way, I think we don't really have editors anymore. We have algorithms. So the top stories that you see, they often start out as what the editors think top stories should be, but in time, they're clicks. Now, so clicking, and I hate to say it, because I think a lot of good stories they just never get the visibility they deserve, and they just kind of fall into a black hole. But you want to prevent it from falling into a black hole, so you want to share it as widely as you can to keep it alive. It's kind of a living thing. You want to nourish it.
Right. Okay. So Patrick, this last year, for the most part, took a year off actual reporting, but you did come back and do a few different things. And he worked on a book that's going to be coming out soon. So I'm going to let him talk about that now, and then we'll come back for questions again after that.
Oh, well, I've for many years thought that, somebody ought to write a book about these horses. And just very briefly, even before the park wanted to get rid of them, I decided I would pitch it as a book idea to the my publisher. And frankly, I didn't expect him to agree, but he surprised me and he agreed. So we had this agreement that I would keep. I was pointing out that, I'm about 3 years from retirement. And so we decided, okay, I'll keep working for a year and a half full time on news. And then they would cut me loose to work on this book and to do some reporting at the same time. So that's what happened. And so I had a luxury of working on this book for a year and a half. And I already had quite a running start because I've, been writing about them for 20 years. I had a lot of material. And then it was early in that process that all of a sudden they were jeopardized. And I remember thinking, oh my God, this is pretty existential. And I could be writing about a herd of horses that will no longer even exist by the time we can get this book out. So my aim in the book was to just tell the story of the wild horses, their origins, their history, and the management of the park. As I mentioned earlier, a great thanks is due to Castle McLaughlin for her really groundbreaking work. She really, so much of what we know about these horses, we know about because of Castle McLaughlin's work in the 80s and her 1989 report. And um, but what I find so interesting is these horses really embody the history, the ranching, the open range history, and the early ranching history, and the Native American history of the horse. And so a lot of that goes into the book. And so I really just tried to tell the whole arc from the origins of the horses, how they got there, and how the park evolved and how the horses were managed, which frankly was very callous and even cruel for most of their existence. They've never really been accepted, but the horses are a huge draw for the park, very popular. So my pitch, we realized that you might or might not be aware that Theodore Roosevelt the Presidential Library is going to be opening in July, and this is going to be a huge national event. It's one of the official 250th anniversary events for the country. So many thousands of people we expect will be flocking to the library and the park, and we thought, hey, wouldn't it be great if we, have a book about the horses in the park? We thought that should give the book a push. So, you know, rather than take a kind of a minimalistic approach to writing about the herd, I take kind of the wide angle view and the broad context. And I must say that of course, I'm biased, but I think it's a great story. I think the material is just very interesting and, deserves a book. And so, that's the gist of the book, I think. But any questions?
All right, let me check the chat. Um, so do you know people are wanting to know how they can get your book, how you can share it.
Oh,
We'll have information. I'll gladly share your information on your book when it comes out, but you can let people know. We were talking about this a little bit beforehand too.
right. Um, it's being published by Forum Communications Printing. So the same company. And I'm assured we would like it to be available by March so that we can be on the shelves in Medora, in advance of the tourist season. And I believe there will be a special website for the book, so one could learn about the book and order the book online. We'll certainly be happy to make it available to booksellers and gift stores like Chris's. So, I think, you should, if you happen to be in Medora. Possibly Chris's store, Chasing Horses might have it on their shelves. There's a bookstore in Medora. They might. We hope to get into the library bookstore, and maybe this is all outside of my hands. I have nothing to do with the marketing of the book. That's all with the business office, and I'm really now a former employee. I'm not even an employee anymore. So. But maybe it will be available online. But we want to make it easy for people to find and to get. And
So,
and so probably by around March,
okay.
should be available.
You want to talk about some of the people that you talked to get the book, or some of the interesting people that you may have talked to a little bit to give a little bit more information about your
Oh,
book?
yes. Well, I mentioned these two brothers, Leo and Frank Kuntz, before, and I've known them for 20 years. Sadly, Leo died around 2018, I believe. Frank's still at it, and it's just been a lifelong struggle. And I do go into that in the book. These two brothers really sacrificed a great deal financially and in terms of relationships in trying to save these horses. And they've had some helpers with the Nakota Horse Conservancy, but they broke from that group. So anyway, and Castle McLaughlin, she's a key player, and I've known her also for years, and had many conversations with Castle during this, that 2.5 year period. And a lot of it was archival. Theodore Roosevelt is a character in this story. Sitting Bull, if you can believe it, is a character in this story. And so a lot of it was historical research at the state archives and libraries and in books. Um, and so it's kind of a mix. And of course, Chris is a character in the book, and I talked to Chris, and we went, we've I've been with Chris and Gary and with Frank in the park, watching the horses on two or three occasions. And so during the book, the writing and the researching of the book, they had this roundup, and I was unable to get there for the actual roundup itself, and I didn't think I'd have good access anyway because they restrict people. But I got out there right after that when they were handling them in the corrals, and I met Gary, Chris's husband, and Frank Kuntz out there, and some others who were there watching the horses. So it was kind of a blend of being a reporter and then being a historical researcher.
Okay. Um, and someone went back to like reporting questions. So, are the state's newsrooms a good place to share wild horse info to hopefully get some non-biased reporting, as all the big players always side on the livestock industry or lobbyists.
Um, I think the thing is, I've been happy to, get the story out about these horses in a very active way. But the thing is, newsrooms, except for the editorial page, they can, overtly express opinion. But in the news columns, we're really just supposed to be disinterested observers. So if you're looking for advocacy, you won't find that in the newsroom. You'll find it on the editorial page if um, but I think mostly think of newspapers, think of news outlets as just creating public awareness, getting the word out.
Okay. Craig wants to know, is there a possibility of enlarging the occupied habitat of TRNP wild horses through cooperative agreements? Somebody else had asked that too before. I can tell you right now, um, I, I've been emailing with the superintendent, and until the legislation is passed or not, um, their hands are kind of tied on their management of the horses. So on decisions that they're making, I guess. So she was a little frustrated at that. I mean, there's things that they just can't do, or can't do anything, it sounds like. So I'm not sure if that would be, I don't know if anyone in North Dakota, you would know this better than me, Patrick, feels that the park needs to be larger.
Well, I can tell you, having studied the history of the park, that it's very unlikely that the park will ever get larger than it is because it's surrounded by mostly by U.S. Forest Service grasslands, so it's already, owned, and they are not necessarily interested in reducing their acreage, or it's in private hands, and these are ranchers who need it for their own grazing land. So I wouldn't even think of that. I would think of enlargement in another sense. If you care about the bloodlines of these horses, you care about the Nakota horses, which really are preserving the historical horse. And sadly, as the book will explain, a lot of that is gone. A lot of that is diluted. Um, and this is why people like Frank and Leo Kuntz and their supporters have been working so hard for so long, and they're really on just a shoestring. And I think so if you think of enlargement, I would think of it in terms of trying to keep this line of horses going. And it's very much up in the air. They are an endangered species, this Nakota horse that, just to be very brief, they wound up they killed the park deliberately killed a lot of these wild stallions years ago, and then they brought in domestic, like quarter horse type horses. So they really, really extensively changed the genetics of that herd. And a lot of the old wildness is frankly gone, but it still exists, I think, in the Nakota horses. So I think there should be a great effort to try to keep that line going. And there are not very many. I think there might be about 750 Nakota horses around the world. Mostly they're in Frank's herd and the now entirely separate Nakota Horse Conservancy herd, with a few smaller breeders scattered around the U.S. and a few in Europe. But it's a very tenuous thread.
Let me ask you this, because this is something I've talked to Frank about, and also even John Eagle. When you, because you've seen the Nakota horses and the horses that Frank has, and when you start looking at the horses that we have now in Theodore Roosevelt National Park, it seems like a lot of the Nakota traits are coming back into that herd. Have you noticed that, or what are your thoughts on that? Like, even from, I know that even like Native Americans say like every 7 years, like, nature heals itself. So is that something that you think is possible within this herd?
The honest answer is I just don't know. I don't know enough about horses and horse genetics to really give you an authoritative answer. I will say that I've been in the park with Frank, and I think I think you were present when Frank told me, and he's told me this several times. He mentioned this again when I saw him later at the time of the roundup in October of 2024. But Frank would tell you that he believes he was seeing some of the old conformation, the body type and coloring of these horses coming back. But then he quickly added, I'm not sure. They're being hammered. He said gonacond,
Right.
we basically have a herd that is at great risk of being a non-reproductive herd. There are only a very few mares that are non-responders to gonacond, so are having foals, and they're, as Chris has pointed out many times, so many of these, there's a lower foal survival rate and fewer foals are thriving. So it sure looks like the park is still trying to kind of kill off the horses, certainly limit their numbers. Frank was seeing some of that, like natural selection is at work in this park. So it's a very harsh environment and only the strong survive. And so that's why, Castle McLaughlin, among others, were just so opposed to this idea of killing off these wild stallions and introducing quarter horses. It's insane, really. It's not what, any biologist would tell you should be doing, yet that's exactly what happened. So I think if they are allowed to, reproduce naturally, live out their lives naturally in their natural band structures, there's certainly a viable chance that this will live on. But if you're going to just relentlessly, do what you can to stop reproduction, and so look, consider the skewing effect that you have when only certain mares are repeatedly giving birth. So only those genes are being passed on, and you have also an aging herd. So it's as of now, it's going to slowly die off unless something happens. Now, this is a debate we can have. I've talked to you about how I believe the historic bloodlines are very important and should be preserved. But you can also, one thing you should know about these horses, though, and that is they came from all over the place, from everywhere. And there's really no strong association to any one breed, and they're kind of a breed of their own, which happens when you have an isolated population. They're literally fenced off. But if you bring in outside, Chris, I think disagrees with me on this, but I think it wouldn't be the worst thing if you brought in some other wild horses, say from the Pryor Mountains, where they are used to dealing with harsh environments. And, you could freshen the bloodlines by bringing in stallions, mares, or both from another herd to kind of freshen the bloodlines. And frankly, if this thing keeps playing out in the way that it is now, that might just be necessary to keep a viable herd going. I think it would be better. I think as a guy who is very interested in historic preservation, I think in a perfect world, you would want to see this kind of native herd thrive. Um, so I think it's an open question. But again, Frank, who's been watching these horses and knows far more about horses and has watched them far longer than me, thinks that he was seeing signs of them coming back. And again, I think if you let natural selection play out over time, that should happen.
Let me ask you this, because I was going to kind of talk about what you did, and I'm not going to get into a big debate with you. My debate with you about introducing new blood is if they were bringing BLM horses and we're talking about gelded stallions, so that's going to do nothing for
Yeah,
the
you would not
viability
want
of.
to bring. Yeah, I would absolutely agree. I would say, that would be stupid. You would just have a horse, but it would be a horse with no future. So
So,
yeah, not a good idea. I would not say that's a solution to anything.
so part of what we're asking for in amendments for the legislation, Senator Hoeven said not fewer than 150 horses, and one, we don't feel that that says anything except for there just has to be 150 horses in the park. And as you mentioned, this is a very rugged terrain. So I think that that's why years of trying to introduce just domestic horses in the park or whatever they were doing was a failure, because it's not only the harsh North Dakota winters and summers, right? We go from like 50 below to 110. I mean, it's such extreme weather here. But even just the ruggedness of the Badlands, I think, is hard for just any horse to adapt to. Um, so our amendment is asking for, there also are just under 200 horses in the park, so we want all of them protected. As you said, 57 of them are older horses. Um, if we're looking at what we're asking for to be amended is for it to say 150 to 200 horses native to North Dakota. What do you think? And somebody else is asking too, um, about bringing Nakota horses back into the park.
Well, I think that it would be logical to bring in Nakota horses. After all, they originated in the park. They are the park horses, just living outside the park. And so I think you could expect them to do, well. There would be an adjustment period if, because they're, maybe being fed hay and the like. One thing, these wild horses don't very often they don't do that well when they're taken outside of the park because they can't eat the
Exactly.
same diet, they don't have the same ecosystem. It can be real difficult for the owner. So yes, I would think that bringing in the Nakota horse and the Kuntz brothers have been pleading with the park for years, and they even had historians, former Park Service historians,
Right?
on their side going to bat for them. Didn't make a difference. So that's not to say, that's not to say it couldn't happen, and that might be sort of like the next fight, after you get the protection language. But yeah, that I think, given the existential threat, I think that's not overblown to say that the herd is at risk. Given that, it would be smart and as I alluded to before, the Frank Kuntz is, and I didn't mention get into this, but Frank is in his mid 70s. He's fighting cancer. He's not going to be alive forever. And what happens to his herd when he's gone? And so, it would be great if the Nakotas could, some Nakotas could be reintroduced into the park.
Did you come out of retirement to write that story?
Well, I am interested. I think, there's been some talk of establishing it's long been a dream of the Kuntz brothers and their supporters to have a sanctuary for the horses, and that's just never become a reality. I think that's another, I think that would be very wise, but it's very difficult. These sanctuaries are hard to, find a sustainable model. And, but if that could happen, that would be helpful too, at least in keeping the bloodlines going. But ideally, they should, people ought to be able to see these horses in their natural environment, Theodore Roosevelt National Park.
Yeah, and we will have, I know, Frank Kuntz and his daughter Krista from Kuntz Nakota Ranch. They will be doing a talk later on this month. I'm trying to get them tied down to a date, and there are a few things happening that they can talk about. They're getting some help really from France of all places. It's been kind of crazy, but there are some
Right.
good things happening with them too. So, what about getting better treatment by getting these horses protected as a distinct population under the Endangered Species Act? I think that Craig, our likelihood of getting that done here is as likely as you guys getting that done out in the West on any of the other herds. We can't get them unclassified as livestock. Like they're still technically classified as livestock. So I'm not sure that we can. They are. I think wild horses are fall under the category of the Endangered Species Act, but I also think that again our environmental laws are being raped really badly at this time too. So um, does anybody else have any questions for Patrick about either news stories or his book or the history of the horses? It was a really good talk, Patrick. Thank you.
Oh, well, it was great to be here. Thank you, everybody.
All right. Well, thank you guys, and we'll be back tomorrow with a few more talks. So thank you for being here, and thank you, Patrick. We appreciate it, and we'll keep you guys updated on our website too when his book comes out. So thank you, Patrick.
Thanks again.